Hello, I'm Mercedes Stephenson, and this is the West Block Politics, Perspectives, and Players. Indigenous leaders representing over 200 communities in Western Canada are in Ottawa this week, urging senators to vote against Bill C-48. That's the government's bill that would place a moratorium on ships carrying gas and crude oil from anchoring along the north coast of British Columbia. Indigenous leaders in some of these communities say that the bill is bad for their economies and that they want the bill to be shelved or to allow them to set up an alternative energy corridor. Joining me now are two of those Indigenous leaders, Helin from the Eagle Spirit Chiefs Council and Raymond from the National Chiefs Coalition. Tell me a little bit about why you're concerned about this bill, Calvin.
Well, firstly, it's basically been done without any consultation of the First Nations communities impacted along the route of our project. We're proposing an energy corridor from Fort McMurray out to the BC coast, and people get confused about some First Nations for a project, some First Nations against. The First Nations that really count are those whose traditional territory it's going through, because they have the constitutional right to say that it can go or it cannot go. So they have the economic power to. And it will basically shelve an enormous opportunity for Indigenous people who've been working on a project for 6 years to create the greenest energy corridor on the planet. And it'll essentially preclude them from being able to generate their own source revenue and help their own communities.
Ray, do you find that people in Ottawa, when you go to speak to them, are surprised that there's Indigenous leaders here who are pro-pipeline and pro having these ships come in to tank out the oil and gas? Because generally what we've heard a lot of has been Indigenous communities who are against it.
People here are confused, like many people across the country. The First Nations who support are like 200 plus nations across Canada, except for the Maritimes, who we haven't contacted yet. People in Ottawa, they wonder why there's people coming from BC a week ago and they're in opposition. I think those people are either very wealthy or they have some other project that they focus on other than oil and gas energy. For my nation, we do have oil and gas reserve under our feet. And how are we going to ship that if a tanker moratorium is put in place, or the Bill 69 with the new environmental assessment process? It's not new, it's the old one, just painted a different color, because both assessment processes carry the residual formula, and that residual formula, when you're reviewing these high value components, First Nations high value components on the land, those are downgraded through the old environmental assessment process, and it's carried forward in a new environmental assessment process. So we put high value on our components. After it goes through the mitigation process of environmental assessment, it comes out as low or medium. So that's a major concern, major flaw in the proposed new environmental assessment.
What kind of reaction are you getting, Calvin, from politicians on the Hill? Are they open to hearing your points?
The politicians have been very open. Really what's happened is I think there's been an orchestrated effort by that's essentially financed by American foundations through Canadian environmental groups to present a front that Indigenous people are opposed to everything. And the way a lot of our chiefs see Bill C-48 is it's it's basically the result of American finance Canadian environmental groups seeking to dictate policy in their traditional territory when they know nothing about the territory, and it's viewed as seeking to create parks in our backyard when the chiefs and the leaders have to look at a holistic group of things to assess a project. Environment is always number one, but they have to look at employment and financing their social programs. So it's really critical to have an opportunity. Most of these communities have over 90% unemployment.
So you don't think that some of the opposition that we've seen in the media publicly portrayed, that that's necessarily legitimate opposition by Indigenous groups? I think some of it is. There's no question that some of it is. But the people that count, it's like looking at the provinces of BC and Quebec, and Quebec's trying to do a project within its boundaries, and the people from BC are saying, hey, that's not a very good project, we object to that. Well, they have no right to legally say what goes on there, and it's the same for Indigenous communities. Indigenous communities have their own traditional territories, they're recognized, and some Indigenous group from southern BC is not supporting pipelines, and they have the right to voice their opposition, but they have no right to stop it, and vice versa. That's so interesting, because we hear so much about the consultation. I know part of what you're doing is going to the United Nations, Ray. What is it you're asking the UN for?
Well, we have the UNDRIP. We have the 94 calls to action. I believe these new bills are geared to remove all the First Nations authority that we have through UNDRIP and through the 94 calls to action. The UNDRIP, I guess the UN would have to uphold everything in the UNDRIP policy to help us be successful in this oil and gas industry.
If I could add to that, basically this government has agreed to support the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous people. That declaration has a whole variety of specific items relating to consultation and so on and so forth. And there's 3 specific provisions, I can't remember the numbers right now, that this Bill C-48 is in complete breach of. So the chiefs want to go to file a human rights complaint and at the United Nations, basically because of the breach of the of UNDRIP, the acronym for that declaration, and for breaching their treaty rights and consultation rights, and for a whole variety of similar kinds of grievances.
Do you think the government has listened to you when they've talked about Indigenous consultation?
Haven't listened at all. Since the Liberal government got into power, we've been seeking to organize a meeting with the Prime Minister, and we haven't even got a hearing from him. That's not consultation, and the reason why Bill C-48 has been rejected by First Nations in our group is because the government simply came out and announced that they're doing this, and that's their version of consultation. Consultation is a very formal process. The government had its application, NEB application, rejected in the Trans Mountain case because it did a lot more than they've done on this bill, and it was still rejected. The court decision said they were just note takers. Well, they didn't even bother taking notes in this case. They just announced they're doing this, and it's just it's something that will have a huge impact on the most impoverished parts of BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan.
Do you have any recourse if the Senate doesn't listen to you and they pass this? What's next?
Our chiefs have filed have passed a resolution, and they're going to file a writ to challenge it for lack of consultation. The Lac aux Lamps community, the community which I'm from, which is on the coast of BC, has already filed a writ. And really, what this amounts to is the poorest people in northern BC and Alberta having to take on the cashed up federal government and waste their money on legal fees when there's no way the federal government can win this case.
Okay. Ray and Calvin, thank you so much for your time today. That's all the time we have, but we really appreciate hearing your perspective.
Thank you.
We'll be back here next week for the West Block.